What's going on, everybody? Today we are going over my favorite week 2 players to get you a win in fantasy football, starting it off with Josh Allen going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. Last Monday night, it was just a dreadful performance from Allen against the Jets. 29 for 41 passing for 236 yards and 4 total turnovers. He had 3 interceptions, lost a fumble, just an absolute disaster like we said. Last season, all year, Josh Allen threw 14 total interceptions. Now, hypothetically, if he kept up this pace that he set on Monday night against the Jets, he would end up with 15 interceptions in just 5 games, eclipsing his total from last year. That is not going to happen. Josh Allen is not going to play this bad all season long. Now, this week, they play the Las Vegas Raiders, who are not even close to the Jets. Their defense is not stellar by any means. Of course, their D-line is pretty solid. They have Max Crosby there, who's going to get pressure on Josh Allen, but they're going to let Allen throw the ball. He's not going to be contained the entire game, and neither is Stephon Diggs or Gabe Davis, in my opinion. And of course, Josh Allen can always punish you with his legs. Now, if we take a look back at last week's game between the Raiders and the Denver Broncos, the Raiders defense couldn't even contain Russell Wilson. And Russell Wilson was not playing amazing in this game by any means, but his stat line says otherwise. So you guys be the judge if you're going to start Josh Allen against the Raiders. Of course, you guys drafted Josh Allen as that top 3 quarterback, so you're probably playing him regardless. We're just saying that he's going to get you a win in week number 1 here. Number 2, we have Chris Godwin going up against the Chicago Bears. In week number 1, Chris Godwin had a pretty mediocre game against the Vikings. He ended with 5 catches for 51 yards on 6 targets. We learned that Baker Mayfield is not Tom Brady by any means. He's not afraid to throw the ball downfield. Last year, Brady was struggling connecting with Mike Evans. We saw in week number 1, Mike Evans had a much better performance than Chris Godwin did. I still believe that Chris Godwin is the safety blanket on this team, and overall, throughout the season, he will garner more targets. Now, something I did find interesting was that the Chicago Bears defense wasn't looking bad at all against the Packers in the first half of last week, and then they let it slide in the second half. They just got exposed in the second half of that game. I think over the course of this game on Sunday, Godwin's going to wear down this defense, get open, and get more targets than he had in week number 1. So I'd be starting Godwin in every fantasy team this coming Sunday. Next up, we have DeAndre Hopkins going up against the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, the Chargers gave up 36 points last week against the Miami Dolphins. We saw exactly what we needed to, by the way, out of Hopkins last week in week number 1. He had 13 targets, and this is exactly what he needs to do every single week to be fantasy relevant if he can't find the end zone. He went up against the Saints, who are not an easy defense by any means. So taking that into account, he is going up against the 32nd ranked defense in week number 1, who gave up 466 yards passing to Tua Tagovailoa. Hopkins should be able to gather around this 10 target mark in this matchup and outperform his projected in week number 2. By the way, Treylon Burks had a very quiet game in week number 1. I just wanted to mention that. I do think he's going to be more involved as the season goes on and really solidify himself as that wide receiver 2 in Tennessee. Number 4, we have T. Higgins going up against the Baltimore Ravens. 0 points in week number 1 for T. Higgins. I know you guys probably hate him right now if he's on your fantasy football team, but you have to start him in week number 2. It's very reassuring that Higgins saw 54 out of a possible 56 snaps on offense and ran a route on every single one of them. If you watch this game, most of his targets were uncatchable balls. These had to be acrobatic catches that not many players in the league could actually make. And also, there were very slippery conditions in this game. So many factors going against T. Higgins in this one. Last week, the Ravens gave up 137 total yards to Nico Collins and Robert Woods receiving. Granted, CJ Stroud had to throw the ball a lot because the Ravens were dominating this game from the very start. Regardless, I'm looking for a big game in week number 2 from Higgins. Not only Higgins, but Chase and Joe Burrow as well. Also, the Bengals are going to be furious about what happened last week. They're going to come out with a vengeance. They're not going to put up 3 points in this game. Trust me there. Number 5, we have Calvin Ridley going up against the Kansas City Chiefs. What a performance from Calvin Ridley in week number 1. If you drafted Ridley with that 3rd or 4th round pick, you should be patting yourself on the back right now. 8 catches, 101 yards receiving, and a touchdown. I can't lie, the Colts defense didn't even look that bad. Ridley just kind of exposed them. He was too much for them to handle. Week number 2, the Jags and the Chiefs game is also expected to be the highest scoring one of the week. Vegas has the over-under set to 51.5 points. Now, what does this mean? It means there's going to be a lot of scoring in this matchup and a lot of targets for Ridley and the other receivers. In week number 1, Lions number 1 receiver Amon-Ra St. Brown had a nice little performance of 19.1 PPR fantasy points against the Chiefs. And I'm betting on more good things to come in week number 2 for Ridley. Also, it's going to be very interesting to keep an eye on Christian Kirk as well in this one. He had a very poor performance last Sunday. I want to see if he bounces back or if Zay Jones is actually that number 2 wide receiver on the Jags that you want to own in fantasy football. Number 6, we have James Cook going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. We just talked about Josh Allen a little while ago. Monday night, this was a game where the Bills looked completely flat from the beginning, except for Stephon Diggs was the one bright spot. And then I'd group James Cook in there as well. I think he looked pretty good. You know, the game script wasn't really in his favor for most of the time. But you know what you're getting from the Bills. They don't like to run the ball. They like to throw the ball a lot more than they run the ball, and it's always been this way. The Jets defense also didn't look bad on Monday night. Now, that being said, we're heading into a matchup where Las Vegas Raiders are not as good as the Jets. This is not going to be the same defense. There's going to be a lot more holes open on the offensive end for the Buffalo Bills. And Cook's floor is also very high because he catches a lot of passes. He had 6 targets on Monday night against the Jets, which was good enough for second on the team, just behind a guy named Stephon Diggs. So I'd expect a great performance this Sunday from James Cook. Next up, we have Jamir Gibbs going up against the Seattle Seahawks. Now, I'm going to do it. I'm going to put Jamir Gibbs on this list. I'm going to throw him on here because he showed crazy potential in the limited number of snaps that he received in week number 1. I think he was only on the field for 19 out of a possible 70 snaps and still managed to put up 8 PPR fantasy points. Even if he sees around 30 to 35 snaps this week, he can get you around 15 PPR fantasy points, which is why I think he's a must start. Seattle's also coming off a very poor defensive performance against the Los Angeles Rams, where they let Kyren Williams run all over them. This is a situation where I could easily see Gibbs getting into the end zone, and that might bleed over into this week 1 performance for the Seattle Seahawks. That poor defensive performance could easily spill over into this week, and I'm sure Dan Campbell is going to want to get Jamir Gibbs more involved in this offense as the weeks go on. Next up at number 8, we have TJ Hockenson going up against the Philadelphia Eagles. Last week, the Eagles let Hunter Henry and Mike Gesicki walk all over them, especially in the red zone. Henry ended up being wide open in this one. He caught a touchdown. After week 1, Philly is ranking dead last in the league against tight ends. Now, we saw in week 1 that Hockenson was heavily targeted in the matchup between Minnesota and Tampa Bay. He had 8 targets for 35 yards, so he couldn't break any of these catches for long distance, but it is reassuring that he had 8 catches on 9 targets in this matchup, just behind Justin Jefferson, of course, for targets. If he sees that type of target share on Thursday night against the Eagles, he's bound to break one for more than, what was his average yardage? Not even 5 yards per catch. So he's bound to break a couple for long distance, and also I think he has a great chance of finding the end zone against the Eagles. Number 9, we have Mike Williams, baby, going up against the Tennessee Titans. Mike Williams, he's got to be the most on and off fantasy football player that I've ever seen. Other than DJ Moore, of course. We talk about the two being very inconsistent. They have a boom or bust week almost every single time out. Week 1, he wasn't really the star of the show. I mean, he was briefly injured in this matchup against the Dolphins, but he's all good to go now. He finished the week with 4 catches for 45 yards. I'm going out on a limb this week saying that this is one of those games where Mike Williams explodes. He's going up against a Tennessee defense who ranked dead last in the league in 2022. That seemed to spill over into week 1 of this year, where they haven't fully fixed the problem. They gave up 305 total yards through the air to Derek Carr and the Saints. Chris Olave had a big game in this one, and so did Rashid Shaheed. Now, since Mike Williams is the deep threat, I want to see some fireworks here in week number 2, and I'm expecting a big game in this one. Last but not least, we have Jalen Hurts going up against the Minnesota Vikings on Thursday night. Last week against the Patriots, this was a very uncharacteristic, sloppy performance from Jalen Hurts and the Eagles' whole team. If I know anything about Jalen Hurts, he is going to be more than motivated in week number 2 to get back to business against the Vikings team, which they had a lot of success against last season. He ended up losing a fumble, by the way, in week number 1 against the Patriots, and he was kicking himself last season for losing that fumble in the Super Bowl. I'm sure that's going to give him a little bit more extra motivation going into Thursday night. Like I said, much easier matchup against the Vikings than against the Patriots defense, who played well. The Vikings defense let Baker Mayfield walk all over them this past Sunday, and let's just say the Eagles offense is a little bit more explosive when they get working than the Bucs offense. I'd watch out for A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert to all have good games this Thursday night. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're new. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.